The warning came not from Ouagadougou, not from Bamako, and not from any regional military alliance. It came from Pyongyang, North Korea, a state separated from West Africa by 9,000 miles of landmass and ocean, has reportedly issued a direct retaliation against Togo over its alleged involvement in destabilization efforts and assassination plots targeting Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. This is not a symbolic statement. This is not rhetorical posturing. North Korea has signaled that silence, complicity, or facilitation of actions against Traoré's government will be met with consequences, political, intelligence-based, and strategic. The Sahel, already a theater of coups, jihadist insurgencies, and anti-French resistance, has now become a stage where global powers you wouldn't expect are picking sides. And North Korea just made its position unmistakably clear. To understand why Pyongyang would involve itself in a West African power struggle, you have to understand what Captain Ibrahim Traoré represents. He's not just another military officer who seized power. He is the face of a generation of young African leaders who came to power rejecting the old order, French influence, Western military presence, conditional aid, and what they see as a rigged system designed to keep the continent dependent. Traoré took control of Burkina Faso in September 2022, overthrowing a transitional government that had itself come to power through a coup earlier that year. His rise was fueled by frustration over the government's inability to stop jihadist violence, anger at foreign troops who seemed to accomplish little, and a deep-seated belief that sovereignty had been sold off long ago. Since then, Traoré has expelled French forces, pivoted toward Russia, strengthened ties with Mali and Niger, and positioned himself as a leader who will not bow to external pressure. That stance has made him a hero to some and a target to others. The accusations against Togo are serious. Reports suggest that individuals or networks connected to Togo played a role in plans to destabilize Burkina Faso's government, potentially including plots to assassinate Traoré himself. Togo, a narrow coastal nation bordered by Ghana to the west and Benin to the east, has long been seen as politically stable by Western standards, but that stability comes with questions. The Nassingbe family has ruled Togo for decades. President Faure Nassingbe took power in 2005 following the death of his father, who had ruled since 1967. The transition was neither smooth nor democratic by international definitions, and while Togo has since held elections, critics argue the system is designed to maintain control. Togo remains aligned with France and Western partners in ways that contrast sharply with the revolutionary governments emerging in the Sahel. It hosts military cooperation agreements, participates in regional security frameworks backed by external powers, and maintains economic ties that keep it within the orbit of influence Traoré and his allies are actively trying to escape. So when allegations surfaced linking Togolese actors to threats against Traoré, it wasn't just a bilateral dispute. It was a proxy confrontation between two visions of Africa's future. On one side, states like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, governed by military leaders who see themselves as liberators breaking free from neo-colonial structures. On the other, states like Togo, Côte d'Ivoire, and Senegal, which remain embedded in traditional alliances with France and the West, maintaining political and economic frameworks that the Sahel revolutionaries view as compromised. The question of who threatened Traoré and why cannot be separated from this larger ideological and geopolitical divide. But the involvement of North Korea changes everything. Pyongyang doesn't issue warnings lightly, and it certainly doesn't retaliate on behalf of African governments without reason. North Korea's interest in Africa is not new. For decades, Pyongyang has cultivated relationships across the continent, often under the radar, providing military training, weapons, construction services, and ideological support to governments willing to engage. During the Cold War, North Korea backed liberation movements and anti-imperialist governments. In more recent years, it has sold arms to regimes in conflict zones, built monuments and infrastructure in countries from Senegal to Namibia, and maintained diplomatic ties even as much of the world isolated it. What North Korea offers is simple: support without the conditions that come with Western aid. No democracy requirements. No human rights lectures. No structural adjustment programs. Just transactional relationships built on mutual interest. Burkina Faso's alignment with North Korea isn't officially confirmed in full detail, but the patterns are visible. Traoré's government has been seeking military and strategic partnerships outside the traditional Western sphere. Russia has been the most prominent partner, but North Korea's involvement suggests a broader strategy. If Pyongyang is willing to publicly retaliate against Togo, it signals that its relationship with Burkina Faso goes beyond arms sales or symbolic gestures. It suggests intelligence sharing, strategic coordination, and a level of commitment that would make attacks on Traoré's government a direct concern for North Korea. This is not charity. North Korea operates on the principle of mutual benefit. If it's defending Traoré, it's because Traoré's survival serves Pyongyang's interests, whether those interests are financial, strategic, or ideological. The retaliation itself is described as political, intelligence-based, and strategic. What does that mean in practice? North Korea has a history of asymmetric responses. It operates in the shadows of global diplomacy, using cyber capabilities, intelligence networks, and covert operations to apply pressure where conventional military action isn't feasible or desirable. Political retaliation could mean targeting Togo's international standing, exposing vulnerabilities, or undermining its relationships with key partners. Intelligence-based retaliation could involve the disruption of Togolese operations abroad, the exposure of sensitive information, or support for opposition elements within Togo. Strategic retaliation could mean bolstering Burkina Faso's defensive and offensive capabilities in ways that shift the regional balance of power. Pyongyang doesn't need to invade or deploy troops. It has other tools, and it knows how to use them. For Togo, this creates a serious problem. The country is small, with a population of around 8 million and an economy heavily reliant on phosphate exports, agriculture, and port revenue. It doesn't have the military capacity to confront a hostile intelligence operation backed by a state actor like North Korea. It also doesn't have the geopolitical weight to shrug off this kind of pressure without consequences. If North Korea follows through on its warning, Togo could find itself isolated within its own region, targeted by networks it can't easily counter, and forced to navigate a conflict it may not have fully anticipated. The question is whether Togo acted independently or with the backing of external powers. If France, the United States, or other Western actors had a hand in the alleged destabilization efforts, then North Korea's retaliation isn't just aimed at Lomé. It's a message to anyone who thinks Traoré can be removed without consequence. This is where the stakes become clear. The Sahel is not just a regional issue anymore. It has become a testing ground for a new kind of geopolitical competition, one where the traditional rules don't fully apply. The Alliance of Sahel States, a confederation formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger after their military governments took power, has positioned itself as a bloc independent of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which they accuse of being a tool of French and Western influence. These three nations have expelled French troops, ended defense agreements, and sought new partnerships with Russia, Turkey, Iran, and now, evidently, North Korea. They are not seeking integration into the Western-led international order. They are building an alternative. That alternative threatens the established power structure in West Africa. France, which has maintained military, economic, and political influence in the region since the end of colonial rule, is watching its position erode. ECOWAS, traditionally aligned with Western interests, has struggled to respond effectively to the wave of coups and military governments. Countries like Nigeria, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire, which have remained within the traditional framework, are now facing a bloc of states that reject their legitimacy and refuse to play by the old rules. The involvement of external actors like Russia and North Korea amplifies this challenge. These are not powers constrained by the same diplomatic norms or accountability mechanisms. They operate with different incentives and different methods. What happens next could redefine the region. If North Korea's retaliation proves effective, it sends a signal that Traoré and his allies have powerful backers willing to act on their behalf. that emboldens the Sahel bloc and puts pressure on governments like Togo to reconsider their alignments. It also raises the possibility of escalation. If Togo, or the powers behind it, respond aggressively, the conflict could spread. Neighboring states could be drawn in. Proxy battles could intensify. The risk of a wider regional war, fueled by external actors with competing interests, becomes real. There's also the intelligence dimension. If North Korea is actively involved in defending Traore, it likely has assets on the ground, networks in place, and capabilities that extend beyond Burkina Faso's borders. That means it could be monitoring threats, tracking movements, and gathering intelligence across West Africa. For governments in the region, this is an unsettling development. North Korean intelligence services are not transparent. They don't operate within international frameworks. If they're active in the Sahel, they add a layer of unpredictability to an already volatile situation. States that thought they could maneuver quietly may find their actions exposed. Operatives who believed they were secure may discover they've been compromised. And then there's the ideological component. Traore isn't just fighting for power. He's fighting for a vision of sovereignty that resonates with populations across Africa who feel their governments have been subservient to foreign interests for too long. His rhetoric is sharp, unapologetic, and popular among young people who see him as someone who finally speaks truth to power. North Korea's involvement reinforces that narrative. It allows Traore to say that the only countries willing to stand with Burkina Faso without conditions are those that have themselves resisted Western dominance. It frames the struggle not as a coup or a military takeover, but as a liberation movement with global significance. Whether or not that narrative is accurate in every detail, it's politically powerful. From Pyongyang's perspective, this alignment makes strategic sense. North Korea has always positioned itself as a leader of anti-imperialist resistance, however cynical that claim may be in practice. Supporting Traore allows it to maintain that image while also securing tangible benefits. Burkina Faso has resources, including gold and other minerals, that could be valuable in trade arrangements. It offers a foothold in a region where North Korea can operate with fewer restrictions than it faces in East Asia. And it provides an opportunity to challenge Western influence in a part of the world where that influence is already under pressure. For a state as isolated as North Korea, these are not small considerations. But there's a deeper question beneath the geopolitics. Is this a strategic move or the start of a larger shift? The involvement of North Korea in West African conflicts suggests that the map of global alliances is being redrawn in ways that don't fit the old Cold War categories or the post-Cold War assumptions about liberal hegemony. States that were once marginal players in global affairs are now inserting themselves into regional disputes, not as proxies for major powers, but as independent actors with their own agendas. The Sahel is becoming a space where those agendas collide, where the rules are still being written, and where the outcomes could set precedents for other regions facing similar tensions. For the people of Burkina Faso, this geopolitical drama plays out against a backdrop of real suffering. Jihadist violence continues to displace communities, destroy livelihoods, and claim lives. The government's pivot away from Western partners has not yet translated into security on the ground. Economic conditions remain difficult. Humanitarian needs are growing. Traore's popularity is built on the promise that sovereignty will bring solutions. But sovereignty alone doesn't stop armed groups or rebuild shattered infrastructure. If the military government can't deliver tangible improvements, the revolutionary fervor that brought it to power could turn into frustration. That vulnerability is why threats to Traore's life are taken so seriously. His government depends on his personal authority. Remove him, and the entire structure could collapse. Which brings us back to Togo. If the allegations are true, if actors linked to Togo were indeed involved in plots against Traore, it raises uncomfortable questions. Who authorized it? Was it state policy or rogue elements? Was it driven by internal calculations or external pressure? Togo's government has not publicly commented on the accusations in detail, and silence in this context is a choice. It could mean denial, deflection, or an attempt to avoid escalation. But silence also allows narratives to harden. In the absence of transparency, assumptions solidify. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger already view Togo with suspicion. North Korea's intervention deepens that divide. And the longer Togo remains quiet, the more it looks complicit. Regional organizations have been conspicuously absent from this confrontation. ECOWAS, which has threatened military intervention against Sahel governments in the past, has done little. The African Union, which often calls for dialogue and restraint, has been largely silent. Part of this is structural. Both organizations are divided internally, with member states holding conflicting positions on the legitimacy of military governments and the role of external actors. Part of this is pragmatic. No one wants to escalate a situation that could spiral into open conflict. But the absence of regional leadership creates a vacuum, and that vacuum is being filled by actors like North Korea who have no interest in regional stability as traditionally defined. The global implications are harder to measure, but no less real. If North Korea can successfully retaliate against a West African state over actions in the Sahel, it demonstrates a level of reach and capability that challenges assumptions about its isolation. It shows that Pyongyang isn't confined to the Korean peninsula or even to East Asia. It can project influence, gather intelligence, and execute strategic operations in regions far from its borders. That has implications for how other states assess North Korea's role in global affairs. It also raises questions about what other relationships North Korea is building that remain below the surface. If Burkina Faso is one partner, who else is in the network? For Western governments, this is a strategic loss. Every military government that aligns with Russia, China, Iran, or North Korea is a government that moves further from the institutions and norms that Western powers have spent decades trying to establish. Every successful challenge to French or American influence is a precedent that can be replicated elsewhere. The Sahel was supposed to be a region where counterterrorism partnerships, development aid, and military cooperation would stabilize fragile states. Instead, it has become a zone of rejection, where those very partnerships are seen as part of the problem. North Korea's involvement is a symptom of that failure, but it's also a symptom of something larger. The international order that emerged after the Cold War was built on the assumption that most states would eventually integrate into a liberal market-oriented system led by the West. That assumption is breaking down. States are choosing different paths, forming different alliances, and defining sovereignty in ways that reject external oversight. North Korea supporting Burkina Faso is bizarre only if you still believe the old rules apply. If you accept that those rules are being contested, it makes perfect sense. The people watching this unfold most closely are the leaders of other African nations. They are calculating. If Traore survives, if his government consolidates power, if his alliance with Russia and North Korea proves effective, then the model he represents becomes viable. Other militaries might see coups as a path to power. Other populations might demand the same kind of defiance. Other governments might pivot away from traditional partners. But if Traore falls, if the destabilization efforts succeed, if external actors manage to remove him, then the message is different. It tells aspiring revolutionaries that rhetoric alone won't protect them. It tells populations that change is risky. It tells neighboring states that the old order still has teeth. That's why North Korea's retaliation matters. It's not just about Togo. It's not just about Burkina Faso. It's about whether a new kind of sovereignty is possible in a world still dominated by powers that resist it. It's about whether states like North Korea can credibly defend partners in distant regions. It's about whether the Sahel's rejection of Western influence is sustainable or temporary. And it's about whether the geopolitical map is really changing, or whether this is just noise before the system reasserts itself. Right now, the answer is uncertain. Traore remains in power. North Korea has issued its warning. Togo is silent. The region is watching. And the outcome of this confrontation, however it unfolds, will be studied by governments and movements around the world looking for lessons. Can a landlocked African nation, surrounded by hostile neighbors and jihadists, Insurgents chart an independent course with the help of a nuclear-armed pariah state on the other side of the planet? The question sounds absurd, but the fact that it's being asked at all tells you how much has changed. What's clear is that the Sahel is no longer just a regional issue. It's a front in a global contest over what sovereignty means, who gets to define it, and what happens to those who challenge the existing order. North Korea's involvement is a reminder that this contest is not confined to the usual arenas. It's happening in places you wouldn't expect, with actors you wouldn't predict, and the consequences are rippling outward in ways we're only beginning to understand. Traoré's survival may depend on how effectively his backers can deter threats. Togo's future may depend on how it navigates a confrontation it may not have anticipated. And the region's trajectory may depend on whether the forces pushing for change can outlast the forces pushing back. The warning from Pyongyang is on the table. The question is whether anyone is prepared for what comes next.